Is going to be featuring Axel Fair-Schulz, who is from State University, New York, Potsdam.
Yes, perfect.
And then we'll be followed by a paper by Vieta Hock, and then finally by Ben Wines. We're running slightly over time, so I am going to be quite strict timing. So 20 minutes, that's your last. Okay, so Axel, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I've made some copies of my outline, but I didn't make enough, only a 15 here because my copy broke after I made the 15th copy. So I'm going to pass this around, and maybe two people or so can share each outline. Before I start with my actual presentation, I want to mention very briefly another project Bill and I are involved with. The collected works of Rosa Luxemburg are being published in English by Verso Books at the moment. And Bill and I were frantically engaged in finishing up editing the third volume, which involves quite a bit of translated material previously unpublished, especially in English, Polish material. And there are always expenses, especially as far as translating costs are concerned. So if you go to the Verso website, there's a link to the so-called Toledo Fund, and if you feel like you would like to make a contribution and accumulate positive karma, then you can go and make a contribution via this Toledo Fund, which helps with the translating expenses, and you can get in touch with Bill and me as well. Okay, my topic, my paper is called Robert Havemann, From Party Loyalist to East Germany's Most Famous Marxist Dissident in the 1960s. And in fact, my paper fits into this conference because this transition took place precisely in the 1960s. Havemann understood himself as a loyal Stalinist in the 1950s, then of course became increasingly alarmed regarding the revelations linked with 1956, but it took until the early 1960s for him to develop a different, far more independent and critical Marxist perspective. Havemann is interesting for a variety of reasons. One major reason is that he was a well-known victim of both the Nazi regime as well as later on the bureaucratic post-Stalinist regimes in Eastern Europe as well. He was condemned to death by the Nazis, managed to survive. His execution order was postponed, and then later on he was put under house arrest in East Germany for many, many years and lost his positions, etc., etc. He was a chemist, an essayist. He was not really a systematic philosopher per se. So in another publication I refer to him as a Marxist moralist. So what I would like to do, in addition to talking about Robert Havermann's career trajectory, I want to put him into a larger context in terms of German history, especially East German history, and in the context of how he fits into dissident Marxists within East German society as well. To give you a sense of the chronology, Havemann was born in 1910, he died in 1982, so living in Germany meant he lived through a variety of different states and regimes. He was born when Germany was still an empire. He came of age during the Weimar Republic in the 1920s. He became politicized at the very end of the Weimar Republic when he joined the German Communist Party in 1932. Then he lived during the Nazi years, where he became active in the anti-fascist underground and eventually was discovered by the Gestapo and sentenced to death by the Volksgerichtshof, and then managed to survive in prison until he was liberated in 1945 by the Red Army. And then, of course, the German Democratic Republic, which is what I will focus on, his experiences in East Germany, his transition from being a supporter of the regime to being a socialist and a Marxist critic of the regime. East Germany officially understood itself as the German Democratic Republic, the official name, and it defined itself as an anti-fascist state in direct opposition not only to the Nazi regime but to West Germany as well. East Germany claimed the legacy of being the home of those Germans who opposed the Nazis, and Havemann very much fit into this because of his anti-fascist biography. It claimed to be a state for the workers and peasants, and there were significant welfare policies, etc., etc., but it never really secured the loyalty of the workers and peasants completely, and that came into focus, of course, at the very end when people voted with their feet by leaving East Germany in large numbers, which triggered the collapse of East Germany. East Germany was part of the Soviet system of satellite states, but it also was Moscow's unloved child, in as much as the Soviets would have preferred at the beginning, in the 1940s and 50s, a neutral, united Germany over East Germany. So East Germany was sort of their second choice, and at the very end, Moscow sacrificed East Germany because it was on the one hand very important to the entire Soviet system, at the same time it was this unloved child, yet without Moscow's support, East Germany was never really viable. Hence, when Moscow's support was withdrawn during the Gorbachev years, East Germany collapsed as well. East Germany, especially in the 1960s, began to define itself as, quote, a socialist nation, which was very peculiar because, well, East Germany also lived under the shadow of West Germany, and the question of, well, two states, one German nation came up again and again. So the ruling Socialist Unity Party developed this concept of a new nation emerging in East Germany, a socialist nation which is qualitatively different from the old German nation. The problem with this concept was its artifice. It was a purely ideological concept, and it did not really resonate with reality. Hence, when the regime collapsed, German nationalism reasserted itself very quickly, and all of this illustrates the idea of a separate East German socialist nation was really not viable. And of course, the official state ideology was Marxism, Leninism, which had, well, not that much in common with either Marxism or Leninism, but was the legitimizing ideology of the ruling party, and the ruling party decided whatever qualifies as Marxism, Leninism at any point in time. Concerning how Havemann fits overall into East German critical Marxists, I think it's useful to think of East Germany's critical Marxists in terms of four categories. The first category I refer to as those who left. Those Marxists who, after World War II and often exile abroad, returned to Germany and explicitly wanted to live in East Germany in order to contribute to the building up of a socialist, anti-fascist alternative. And I want to just in passing mention some names. Leo Koffler, philosophy professor at the University of Halle, who taught in the late 1940s Marxism-Leninism there until he realized there's little space for a genuine Marxist perspective in East Germany, so he went to the West already in 1947. Then perhaps East Germany's most famous Marxist who left, Ernst Bloch. He taught at the University of Leipzig until the 1960s, and then in the 1960s decided not to return from a conference in the West. And Ernst Bloch, who left in 1961, is accompanied by Hans Meyer. Bloch, a philosopher, Hans Meyer, an expert on German literature. Both tried to find spaces for a more critical non-dogmatic kind of Marxism, but by the early 1960s they decided such space is increasingly not available anymore, so they went and left East Germany. The second category is those who decided to not leave for a variety of reasons. So they still wanted to be critical Marxists, hence they had to write for the draw, meaning they knew their manuscripts could not be published in the foreseeable future, yet they still wanted to write, hoping for better days. The most famous example of this approach is Fritz Behrens, the economist. And that was especially tragic in his case because writing for the draw also meant you had next to no influence and really demoralized and broke people. Then there's the third category, those who became open dissidents, yet decided to stay in East Germany, and Havemann fits into this category. This category includes a variety of other people, Wolfgang Harich, for example, who broke with the Ulbricht regime in 1950 and ended up with a lengthy prison sentence. Another example is the writer Stefan Heim, who did not get a prison sentence because his reputation abroad was too large scale. It would have been too embarrassing for East Germany. But Stefan Heim, even though he lived in East Germany, increasingly became almost more of a West German writer. I remember when I grew up in East Germany, I never realized where Heim actually lived because his books were only available, or largely available in the West, especially in the 1970s. And then of course there's the case of Rudolf Barrow, the eco-socialist who ended up with a prison sentence as well. And Robert Havemann. Robert Havemann was perhaps the biggest headache for East Germany because on the one hand they wanted to silence him because he was a vocal critic. On the other hand, that was difficult inasmuch as Havemann was condemned to death by the Nazis, and silencing someone like that in East Germany, given that East Germany defined itself as an anti-fascist state, was just too much riddled with contradictions. And then there's a fourth category of people I call the tightrope walkers. This includes characters such as Bertolt Brecht and Jürgen Kuczynski, people who kind of walk this fine line between criticizing the regime officially while at the same time not going too far. Okay, so let me say something about Havermann's background. He was born in Munich into a solid middle-class family. His father was a teacher as well as a writer. His mother was a painter of an aristocratic background. Eventually, Havemann will study chemistry, in particular physical chemistry in Munich as well as in Berlin. He will earn his PhD, and in 1937 he will start working for the Pharmacological Institute in Berlin. In 1943 he will get his second doctorate, his Habilitation, and he will become increasingly involved in research necessary for the war effort. Down the road, this will save his life, because when the Nazis sentence him to death, his friends, some of his friends well connected in the scientific community, make the case that his research is important for the war effort, so his execution is postponed. Presumably he would help Germany win the war, and then he can get executed. Fortunately for him and for all good, decent people, the things turned out quite differently. The Red Army eventually liberated him in 1945. Havemann joins the Communist Party in 1932. At that point, the German Communist Party is already thoroughly Stalinized. But Havemann is not really interested in the particulars of the party line and philosophical questions as much as he is interested in finding a movement that is aggressively anti-fascist in orientation. So he later on always argues he joined the Communist Party because he regarded him as the most openly opposed to the Nazi regime. But within the Communist Party, he soon encounters difficulties because, well, he is very unhappy with the so-called third period and this notion of, on part of the Communist Party, looking at Social Democrats as the most important opponent and the Nazis only as a secondary threat. So very quickly, Havemann will become involved with an organization called Neubeginnen, which was a relatively small group, New Beginnings, of people from the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party and some smaller leftist and socialist and Trotskyist groups. And what tied them all together was the conviction that the left has to be unified in opposing fascism as the most important threat. Unfortunately, Neubeginnen did not have enough influence to either change the dogmatism of the Communist Party leadership or the equally entrenched dogmatism of the Social Democratic leadership, because they refused to work with the communists and the communists refused to work with them. Eventually, Havemann will become a leading member and in fact a leader of the European Union, not the European Union, but a resistance group, which was explicitly dedicated toward liberating and protecting forced laborers as well as hiding Jews as well. And his involvement with this group was honored by Yad Vashem in 2005 when he was officially initiated posthumously as one of the so-called righteous Gentiles. As I've pointed out before, he works in the underground, distributes Communist Party literature. He is involved with some of the Bulgarian people linked with Georgy Dimitrov and all sorts of other political things. So he sooner or later moves into the focus of the Gestapo. The Gestapo arrests him and he's eventually sentenced, but he's postponed. He will spend his prison sentence in Brandenburg, and one of his fellow prisoners in Brandenburg will be Erich Honecker, who later on will become East German leader. And in fact, Havemann and Honecker will have some sort of a connection based on their common time in the Brandenburg prison. So when some East Germans have difficulties, Havemann will write to Honecker and say, remember our anti-fascist past, we have to be different, and Honecker too, at least in some cases, accepts what Havemann demands. For example, Jürgen Fuchs is allowed to leave East Germany, and so on and so forth. After the war, after he's liberated, Havemann will settle in what will become West Berlin, and he will become one of the directors of the remnant of the old Kaiser Wilhelm, Emperor William Research Institute, sort of the predecessor of the Max Planck Society. And he will be kicked out in 1947 because he is a vocal member of the German Communist Party, and later on of the SED, and he's very outspoken against the Cold War efforts on part of the US. He's very critical of the Truman administration. He is very critical of the American hydrogen bomb and later on of Korea as well. So the Americans insist that he should not be allowed to work as the director anymore, and eventually he will be barred from entering even the facilities of the institute. 2 minutes left. All right, then I have to fast forward a little bit. Eventually, Havemann loses his positions in West Berlin. He will move to East Berlin, become a professor at Humboldt University, become the dean for student affairs, and will get all sorts of awards, but he will become increasingly ill at ease with the party line, especially after 1956 and Khrushchev's revelations. And eventually, in the early 60s, he will give a series of lectures on the question, has philosophy aided the natural sciences in solving their problems? And to him, philosophy is largely Marxist-Leninist philosophy. And his conclusion as a chemist and a physicist is Marxist-Leninist dogmatism is out of touch with new developments in physics in terms of quantum mechanics and so on and so forth. This series of lectures is the end for him, especially when he publishes his lectures in West Germany in a book called Dialectic Without Dogmatism. So, to make a long story short, Havemann will lose his professorship, he will be expelled from the Socialist Unity Party, and he will be put under house arrest. And he will even officially be removed from any references to his anti-fascist activities. East Germany will publish a dictionary of anti-fascists victimized by the Nazis, and eventually Havermann's name will be erased from that. Havemann, as the 1970s unfold, will become increasingly interested in ecological questions as well. He will write a book, Industriegesellschaft am Scheideweg, which is essentially a kind of eco-socialist manifesto, where he will argue that one of the weaknesses of Marxism, and he sees it, or of many Marxists, is the overemphasis on productivity as opposed to finding a more sustainable society. To him, this is sort of a remnant from the 19th century. So he will try to find symbiosis between environmentalist and Marxist ideas. He was not a systematic philosopher. Many people who have read his books have said, well, they're full of nice platitudes about how it is important to be open-minded and to, enter into a dialogue with different schools of thought, etc., etc. When I looked at Havermann's writings, I saw very little engagement with other currents, with the Praxis group in Yugoslavia or the Petöfi circle in Hungary. He was on very friendly terms with Leszek Kolakowski and especially Adam Schaff from Poland. But again, there's very little engagement, especially with Adam Schaff, who would have been a very good person for Havemann to engage with. So Havemann was at the end less of a systematic philosopher and scholar and more of an essayist, which is also, of course, the result of the fact that he was unable to work in East Germany. He spent the last decade and a half of his life under virtual house arrest, and then he died in 1982, at the time when East Germany was entering into its final decade of decay. Today, Havemann is commemorated in Germany largely as an opponent of the SED regime, and his Marxism is, at least officially, downplayed. And I think it is important to rediscover his Marxism as well, to not just see him as a civil rights activist, but as someone who understood civil rights cannot really be sustained in a society without social justice. So he tried to bring together civil rights tradition with a social justice tradition and this idea of an eco-socialist sustainable future. He does not offer final solutions and permanent answers. In fact, he spent much of his life in East Germany rallying against what he called the general administration of eternal truth. But I think what one can learn from him is the challenge to always think again about how one can push for the moral and ethical parameters of socialism under new circumstances. So Havemann should continue to engage us on the left. I probably went over time a little bit. Thank you.